In the heart of the village square, they called her a witch. Her only crime was knowing the secrets of the forest, the herbs that could heal where prayers had failed. But fear, stoked by the words of a cruel priest, was a sickness she could not cure. They tied her thin wrists to the splintered wood, her pleas for reason lost in their hateful jeers. As the priest raised a torch to cast the first flame, a sound of thunder silenced the crowd, not from the heavens, but from the heart of the forge. For more stories where medieval steel defends a heart of gold, join our fellowship by subscribing, and tell us which country our story has reached. The air in the village square was thick with the smell of wet earth and stale fear. It clung to the rough wool of the villagers' tunics and settled like a shroud over the mud, churned by dozens of shuffling feet. For Elara, the air tasted of betrayal. The ropes dug into the skin of her wrists, pinning her to the splintered wood of the stake. Each coarse fiber felt like a separate accusation. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, a sea of expressions she once knew. There was the farmer whose son she had nursed through the winter fever with willow bark tea. Now he held a rock in his hand, his eyes cold and empty. She saw the weaver whose daughter's broken arm she had set and bound. The woman now clutched a wooden cross to her chest and whispered a prayer, not for Elara, but against her. They were the same people she had served. The same hands she had healed were now clenched into fists. A cold dread, sharp and heavy as a shard of ice, settled deep in her belly. This was not a trial. It was a ritual, a sacrifice to the god of a poor harvest and a long winter. She was the offering. Above the low murmur of the mob, one voice rose sharp and righteous. Father Alcuin stood on a small wooden platform, his black robes a stark contrast to the grey, unforgiving sky. He was a thin man, made of bone and conviction, and his voice was a razor cutting through the thick air. He did not shout. He spoke with a chilling certainty that commanded the silence. He told them of the devil's work, of shadows that crept into good Christian homes disguised as kindness. He spoke of ancient evils that wore the face of a simple healer, turning God's own green earth into a source of poison and dark magic. He pointed a long bony finger at Elara. "She offered you comfort from the forest," he declared, his voice ringing with false piety. "But the forest is the devil's cathedral. Her remedies are not gifts of healing. They are bargains, pacts made in darkness to steal the health of your crops and the piety of your souls." A woman in the front sobbed, a sound of pure terror. The farmer who held the rock now looked at it as if he knew what he must do. The fear Father Alcuin stoked was a living thing, a serpent that coiled around their hearts and squeezed until all reason had fled, leaving only hatred behind. Elara's mind reeled. She remembered gathering herbs by the creek in the morning dew, her hands stained with the green of life. She remembered grinding roots into poultices, the clean, earthy scent filling her small cottage. There was no darkness in it. There was only the quiet satisfaction of easing pain, of mending what was broken. How could they believe this? How could they stand by and watch it happen? She scanned the crowd one last time, a desperate, silent plea in her eyes. She sought a flicker of doubt, a shadow. Of the kindness she had once shown them reflected back at her. She found none. Their eyes were hard, convinced. They saw not Elara, the healer. They saw the witch of Father Alcuin's sermon. The cold was seeping into her bones now, a deeper chill than the autumn air could explain. It was the cold of absolute loneliness, the cold of a world that had turned its back on her completely. She understood then that there was no escape. Her knowledge, her skills, her entire life had been twisted into a death sentence. Father Alcuin finished his sermon, his arms raised to the sky as if drawing power from the clouds themselves. The crowd was a beast, tamed and hungry, waiting for his command. He stepped down from the platform, his movements slow and deliberate. One of his acolytes handed him a burning torch. The flame sputtered in the damp air, an angry orange eye in the gloom. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the faces in the mob look like grotesque masks. He walked towards the stake, towards her. With every step he took, Elara's world grew smaller, shrinking until it was only the rough wood at her back and the approaching fire. She could feel the heat on her skin. She could smell the burning pitch. She closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. This was the end. She braced herself for the touch of the flame, for the searing pain that would consume everything. The crowd surged forward, a collective gasp of anticipation rising from their throats. The priest raised the torch high. Just as the heat of the torch threatened to kiss her skin, a sound shattered the moment. It was not a human cry, nor the crackle of fire. It was the sound of iron striking iron, a single, deafening clang that echoed off the damp stone of the cottages and shook the very air in the square. It was a sound of purpose, of work, of something unyieldingly real in a world lost to hysteria. Another followed, clang, and another, clang. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, a heartbeat of thunder that demanded attention. The crowd, which had been a single beast straining toward a kill, faltered. Heads turned from the stake towards the source of the sound. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the mob, replacing their righteous fury with a primal uncertainty. Even Father Alcuin paused, the torch held aloft, his face a mask of irritation at the interruption. From the dark, gaping mouth of the forge, a figure emerged. He seemed to pull the shadows and smoke of his domain with him into the grey daylight. It was Torin, the blacksmith. He was a man built of the iron he shaped. His shoulders were a yoke of muscle, and his arms, bare to the elbow, were thick with cabled sinew, stained black with soot. He wore a heavy leather apron over simple wool trousers, and in one massive hand he held the long-handled smithing hammer, its head resting against his shoulder as if it were a woodsman's axe. He was not walking. He was advancing, and the earth seemed to tremble slightly with each heavy step. The crowd parted for him. They did not move out of respect, but out of an instinctual fear, the way small animals scatter before a bear. He paid them no mind. His eyes, dark and deep-set, were fixed on the stake. They were fixed on Elara. He did not look at the priest. He did not look at the faces of the villagers. His focus was singular, absolute. Elara opened her eyes, having braced for fire, but met only with the strange, rhythmic thunder. She saw him moving toward her, a giant cutting a path through the sea of her accusers. She did not know what to feel. Fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now a different kind of fear. The blacksmith was a man of silence and solitude, a figure of village law more than a neighbor. No one spoke to him unless they needed metal mended, and even then words were sparse. To see him here now was to see a mountain move. He stopped directly in front of Father Alcuin, dwarfing the thin priest. The torch flame danced in the blacksmith's impassive eyes, but he did not flinch. For a long moment the only sounds were the sputtering fire and the ragged breathing of the crowd. The priest, recovering his composure, puffed out his chest. "This is God's work, Smith," the priest hissed, his voice thin and reedy in the blacksmith's shadow. "Return to your pit. This does not concern you." Torin did not answer him. His gaze remained on Elara, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Then slowly he turned his head and looked at the priest. He looked at the crowd. He opened his mouth, and the voice that emerged was a low rumble, rough and grating from disuse, like stones grinding together. "I claim her," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of his hammer, landing with absolute finality in the stunned silence. He let the declaration hang in the air for a heartbeat, then added the words that would change everything. "She will be my wife." A collective gasp swept through the square. It was a sound of pure shock. Father Alcuin's face contorted, his pale skin turning a blotchy red with fury. He opened his mouth to object, to scream of sacrilege, but no words came out. The blacksmith's claim was a challenge not of faith, but of a different, older power. An ancient tradition, rarely used but never forgotten, of a man's right to claim a wife, even from the pyre. Before the priest could find his voice, Torin moved. He handed his hammer to a stunned villager, who took it dumbly, his hands shaking under its weight. He then walked to the stake. He reached for the ropes that bound Elara's wrists. His hands were huge, calloused and scarred, but his touch was surprisingly steady as he worked the knots loose. Elara flinched at his closeness, her body still braced for pain. But there was no cruelty in his touch. He simply unfastened the ropes, his movements efficient and sure. The bindings fell away, and her arms, numb and aching, dropped to her sides. He looked at her for a moment, his face giving nothing away. Then he took her arm in a grip that was not rough, but inescapably firm. He pulled her gently to her feet. Her legs were weak, trembling. Without another word, he turned and began to lead her back the way he had come, straight through the frozen crowd. She stumbled behind him, a captive of a different sort, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She was not burning. She was alive, but she was being led away by a silent, terrifying giant who had just declared her his property in front of the entire world. She was saved from the fire, but she had no idea what fate now awaited her in the shadows of the forge. The walk across the square was the longest of Elara's life. Torin's grip on her arm was a manacle of warm, calloused flesh, and he moved with a purpose that dragged her along in his wake. The villagers remained frozen, a gallery of dumbstruck faces. They did not move. They did not speak. The power of the priest's words had been broken by the simple, undeniable power of the blacksmith's presence. They watched as the giant led the witch into his lair, the smoke from the forge chimney curling into the grey sky like a dragon's breath. The entrance to the forge was a dark maw that swallowed them whole, leaving the hostile light of the square behind. Inside, the world changed. The air was hot and thick, tasting of coal dust and the sharp tang of cooling iron. It was a place of shadows and firelight, where tools hung in orderly ranks on the stone walls, their metal surfaces gleaming in the embers' glow. Racks of tongs, rows of hammers and stacks of iron bars all sat in their designated places, a testament to a life of discipline and hard labor. This was his world. It was a place of creation and destruction, where raw, unyielding metal was heated, beaten, and forced to obey the will of its master. It was loud, violent, and intimidating, yet there was an honesty to it that the village square lacked. There were no lies here. There was only work and fire and the shaping of things. Elara felt a strange sense of calm begin to settle over the terror in her heart. The chaos of the mob felt a world away, its shrill hysteria unable to penetrate these thick stone walls. Here the only sound was the deep, sleepy crackle of the massive forge hearth and the hiss of steam from a quenching bucket. Torin released her arm. He moved to the hearth, his movements economical and sure. He took a long iron poker and stoked the embers, coaxing them from a dull orange to a bright, hungry yellow. The firelight played across the harsh planes of his face, but his expression remained a stony mask. He seemed not to notice her, or if he did, he gave no sign. He was a man returning to his element, the fire his only confidant. He worked for a few moments, his focus entirely on the fire. He was a creature of routine, and not even the day's extraordinary events could break him from it. This quiet, predictable rhythm was more comforting to Elara than any words could have been. A man who tended his fire with such care was not a man of pure chaos. After a time he seemed satisfied with the hearth. He turned and looked at her, his gaze direct but not unkind. He gestured with his head toward a heavy wooden door at the back of the forge, one she had never noticed before. He walked to it and lifted the simple iron latch. The door swung inward, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. He stood aside, holding the door open, a clear invitation for her to enter. Hesitantly, she stepped past him and into the space. It was a simple room, with a stone floor and a single small window that was thick with years of grime and soot. A narrow cot with a wool blanket folded neatly upon it stood against one wall. A small, rough-hewn table and a single stool were the only other furniture. The air was cool and still. It was more a cell than a chamber, but it was clean, and it was quiet. She stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, unsure of what to do next. She heard him step back from the doorway. The heavy door swung shut, closing with a soft, solid thud. The iron latch clicked gently back into place. It was the sound of a door being closed, not locked. She was alone. Silence descended, broken only by the faint, muffled sounds from the forge on the other side of the wall. She heard the scrape of metal, the groan of the bellows, and then the familiar rhythmic sound began once more. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of his hammer, the sound that had saved her life. It was a steady, powerful rhythm, the heartbeat of her new reality. She was a prisoner in this room, yet she was safer than she had been at any point in the last week. She was in the care of a terrifying stranger, a man who had claimed her as his wife, but had not spoken another word to her. Elara walked to the cot and sat down, the straw mattress rustling beneath her. She looked at her hands, at the raw red marks the ropes had left on her wrists. She was alive. She was breathing. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first one that did not feel laced with the immediate threat of death. The air filled her lungs, cool and still. She was saved from the fire, but she did not know if she was free. And as the steady sound of the hammer continued its unending work, she wondered what price she would have to pay for this sanctuary. The rhythm of the hammer was the only clock Elara had. It marked the long hours of the afternoon, each strike a second passing in her strange new life. When the hammering finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavy, expectant. The forge outside her door grew quiet. The fire banked for the evening. She sat on the cot, every muscle tense, listening. The iron latch on her door lifted. The heavy wood swung open, and Torin stood there, a massive silhouette against the dying glow of the forge. He did not enter. He simply bent down and placed a steaming wooden bowl and a thick slice of dark bread on the floor just inside the threshold. He met her eyes for only a second before retreating, closing the door as gently as before. Elara stared at the offering. The rich scent of meat and root vegetables filled the small room. Hunger, sharp and demanding, warred with a lingering fear. But it was not the food of a jailer. It was a worker's meal, simple, hot, and life-giving. She crept forward and took the bowl. The stew was thick, and the bread was coarse but fresh. She ate, and for the first time in days, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach was replaced by a slow, spreading warmth. This became their ritual. Every evening, the latch would lift, and a bowl would appear. He never spoke. He never entered. He simply provided. After 2 days of this silent routine, a sliver of courage returned to her. She could not just be a passive creature in a cage, waiting for food. She needed to reclaim a piece of herself. Her eyes fell on the grimy window, a grey square that let in gloom but no light. She found a bucket, a rag, and with water from a barrel just outside her door, she began to scrub. She worked for an hour, scraping away years of soot and grime. Slowly, miraculously, the outside world began to appear. First a patch of green from the forest edge, then the deep blue of the evening sky. When she was finished, a clear, clean pane of glass remained. The next morning, a single, sharp beam of sunlight cut through the dusty air of the room, illuminating it for what felt like the first time ever. When Torin brought her meal that evening, he paused for a fraction of a second at the doorway, his eyes drawn to the light. He said nothing, but he had noticed. A silent conversation had begun. She saw him glance at her thin, tattered cloak one chilly morning. That night, a new one was hanging on a wooden peg beside her door. It was heavy, dark wool, smelling faintly of wood smoke, and the wild smell of lanolin. When she wrapped it around her shoulders, it was like a shield against the cold, a solid, unspoken gesture of protection. In turn, she noticed the long, frayed tear in the shoulder of his thick leather apron. It was a flaw in his armor, a vulnerability he ignored. One night, when the deep, rhythmic sound of his sleeping breath came from a cot on the other side of the forge, she crept out of her room. She took the apron from its hook, and with a needle and gut thread she found in a small mending kit, she sat in the faint moonlight from her clean window and repaired it. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of careful order against the scarred leather. She hung it back before dawn. The next day she saw him run his thumb over the new seam, his brow furrowed in thought. One afternoon she was watching him work. A piece of white-hot iron spat from the anvil, landing squarely on his forearm. He let out a low, guttural sound, a curse bitten off before it could fully form. He flinched, pulling his arm back, but did not stop his work, ignoring the angry red mark that was already beginning to blister. Elara's healing instincts took over. Fear was a distant thought, replaced by a clear sense of purpose. She slipped out of her room to the small patch of earth behind the forge, where a few precious herbs she had carried in her pockets were beginning to take root. She gathered the leaves of a comfrey plant, crushing them between 2 stones to make a paste. She re-entered the forge, holding the small poultice in her hand. He saw her coming and stopped hammering, his body going tense. He stood over the anvil, a wounded bear, wary and suspicious. She approached him slowly, her eyes calm and steady, holding out the crushed herbs as a silent offering. She did not speak. She simply looked at his arm, then at him. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. His first instinct was to recoil, to hide the injury, to reject any form of help, but he saw no pity. In her eyes, he saw only competence. He saw a healer ready to do her work, Slowly, reluctantly, he extended his arm. She took his massive, scarred wrist in her small, gentle hand. His skin was hot, his muscles bunched like rope beneath the surface. She carefully applied the cool green paste to the angry burn. His entire body was rigid, but he did not pull away. He stood perfectly still, allowing her to tend to him, his eyes watching her face, her focused expression, the gentle movements of her hands. She wrapped the wound with a clean strip of linen from her pocket. When she was finished, her hands lingered on his arm for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His gaze dropped to where her small hands rested on his powerful forearm. In that single, silent touch, a fragile bridge was built between them. It was a bridge made not of words, but of mutual vulnerability. He had allowed her to see his pain, and she had offered her healing in return. The unspoken conversation had reached a new profound depth. Days bled into a quiet rhythm. The forge became a world unto itself, governed by the rising of the sun and the glow of the fire. A fragile peace settled between the blacksmith and the healer, a trust built not on promises, but on the steady accumulation of small, silent kindnesses. Elara, who had once known the name of every person in the village, now knew only the quiet moods of the giant who had saved her. She saw the man he was, a creature of discipline and deep, guarded stillness. But she knew nothing of the man he had been, or the ghosts that lived behind his unreadable eyes. To understand the silence of the blacksmith, one had to understand the noise that had once filled his life. Years ago, Torin had not been a hermit. He had been a husband and a father. He had returned from a lord's war with enough coin to build the forge, and enough weariness to desire nothing more than a simple life. He had married a woman named Elara, whose laughter was as bright and clear as a riverstone. They had a daughter, Maeve, a small girl with her mother's smile and a spirit as wild as the forest flowers she loved to gather. His life then was not one of silence. It was filled with the sound of Maeve's feet running across the cottage floor, the gentle cadence of Lyra's singing as she worked her loom, and the easy talk of a family bound by a simple, powerful love. His forge was a place of work, but his home was a place of light. The smell of hot iron would mingle with the scent of baking bread, and the soot on his hands would be gently wiped away by his wife at the end of the day. He was not just a blacksmith. He was a man deeply, completely rooted in the soft earth of his family. Then the winter fever came. It arrived silently, a cold breath in the night that settled first in his daughter's small chest. Her laughter was replaced by a shallow, rattling cough. Lyra, in trying to nurse her, fell ill next. Her song went quiet. Torin, a man whose strength could shape steel and move stone, was utterly helpless against this invisible enemy. He watched the two people who were his entire world be consumed by a fire he could not quench. In his desperation, he had gone to the one place he had been taught to go for solace. He had gone to the church. He found Father Alcuin not in prayer, but counting tithe coins by candlelight. Torin did not beg for a miracle. He was a practical man. He begged for aid, for a portion of the abbey's wine to soothe their throats, for old linen, for clean bandages, for a prayer to be said at their bedside. Father Alcuin had looked at him with eyes devoid of all compassion. He told Torin that the fever was rampant, a sign of God's displeasure with a village clinging to old ways. He spoke of sin and penance. Then he delivered the words that shattered Torin's world. "The sickness is a divine judgment," the priest had said, his voice as cold as a tombstone. "It purges the community of its weaknesses. Pray for their souls, blacksmith. It is all you can do." He had offered no help. He had offered no comfort. He had offered only the hollow cruelty of his piety. Torin had returned to his cottage to find the silence he now knew so well. It was a silence that was not empty, but filled with the deafening absence of a laugh, of a song. He buried his wife and daughter himself, on a small hill overlooking the forest, for he would not allow the priest to speak empty words over the soil that held his heart. After day, the door to his cottage was barred. The man he had been died with them. He retreated into the forge, and the fire in its hearth became the only warmth he would allow himself. It was a fire he could control. He built a wall of silence around his grief, and his work became a way to beat the endless pain into a shape he could endure. And now, in the present, he stood in the doorway of his forge, watching Elara. She was kneeling in her small garden, her gentle hands tending to the green, living things she had coaxed from the earth. The afternoon sun lit her hair, and for a painful, fleeting moment, she reminded him of the wife he had lost. He saw in her resilience the same quiet strength, in her healing touch the same life-giving grace. A deep, protective instinct, an emotion he thought long dead and buried, surged in his chest. He understood in that moment that when he had walked into the square, he was not just saving a condemned woman. He was standing guard over a memory. Building a wall of iron around a flickering flame, he refused to let be extinguished by the same cold, cruel wind. He would not let the ghosts of his past suffer the same fate twice. The fragile peace inside the forge was a world away from the storm brewing outside it. In the village church, Father Alcuin stood before his flock, his heart a knot of cold, humiliated fury. He had been publicly defied, his divine authority subverted by a brute with a hammer. The shame was a fire in his veins, and he would not rest until the entire village felt its heat. His sermons changed. Where once he had spoken of forgiveness and light, he now spoke only of shadows and corruption. He did not need to name Torin or Elara. His words were crafted with a poisoner's skill, designed to infect the minds of his listeners with a creeping dread. "A darkness has taken root in our midst," he proclaimed from the pulpit, his voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried to the back of the church. "It hides not in the forest, but behind a wall of stone and iron. It takes the shape of a good man, a strong man, and binds his soul with the foulest of enchantments." He painted a picture for them, of a witch not burned but empowered, her evil now shielded by the very man they had once respected for his strength. Torin's act of defiance was not honor, he told them, but bewitchment. The silence from the forge was not peace, but the quiet plotting of a great evil. Fear, once quelled, was reborn with a zealous fervor. The forge, which had always been a landmark of industry, became a place of superstition. Mothers would pull their children to the other side of the path, whispering prayers and shielding their eyes as they passed. A farmer whose plough had broken would travel half a day to the next village rather than seek out the blacksmith. The rhythmic clang of Torin's hammer, once a familiar sound of village life, now sounded ominous, sinister. From her clean window, Elara watched the siege take shape. She saw the averted gazes, the wide berth the villagers gave their home. The sanctuary Torin had provided was becoming an island, and the sea of fear was rising around them. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She had escaped the fire, but the priest was building a new pyre for them, one made of isolation and whispers. Torin seemed not to notice. He rose with the sun, fired the forge, and worked the iron with the same stoic focus as always. His routine was his armor, his labor a defiant prayer against the encroaching darkness. But Elara saw the subtle changes. She saw the way his eyes would scan the path to the forge, the way he would pause his hammering to listen to sounds from the village. And at night, she would see him sitting by the dying embers, his massive hand resting on the hilt of an old battle-worn sword he kept propped against the wall. He was silent, but he was vigilant. He was a guardian on a lonely wall, waiting for an attack he knew was coming. Having poisoned the minds of the common folk, Father Alcuin aimed his venom higher. He requested an audience with the Baron, the region's lord, a man more concerned with taxes and order than with village squabbles. Alcuin, however, knew how to speak the language of power. He stood before the Baron in his hall, a portrait of humble concern. He spoke not of his own wounded pride, but of the threat to the Baron's rule. "My lord," he said, his voice grave, "the people are afraid. This blacksmith has defied the church and harbors a condemned witch. This open rebellion plants a seed of chaos. If one man can ignore the law of God, soon others will ignore the law of the land. Your law." He let the words sink in, a skillful appeal to the Baron's deepest fear, instability. He spoke until the Baron, a man of simple solutions, grew weary of the talk of witches and enchantments. The Lord wanted only for the problem, and the priest's incessant complaints, to go away. A few days later, the consequence of that meeting arrived. The sound was alien to the world of the forge, not the clang of iron or the crackle of fire, but the sharp, metallic jingle of bridles and the thud of hooves in the dirt. Elara looked out her window, and her blood ran cold. Two soldiers, clad in the Baron's leather and steel livery, sat on horseback before the forge. They were not a mob of angry villagers. They were the law. One of the men dismounted, his armored boots crunching on the gravel. He walked to The great wooden door of the forge, his hand holding not a weapon, but a rolled scroll stamped with the Baron's wax seal. He did not knock. He hammered his mailed fist against the wood. The sound echoed through the forge like a drumbeat of doom. It was the sound of the outside world, of power and judgment demanding entry. Torin's hammer fell silent. The sanctuary had been breached. The heavy thud of the guard's fist echoed the frantic beating of Elara's heart. Torin moved from the anvil, his face impassive, and lifted the heavy iron bar securing the door. He swung it open, filling the entire frame, a silent mountain of a man meeting the Baron's law. "By order of the Baron," the guard announced, holding up the scroll, "you are summoned to the keep, both of you." His voice tried for authority, but wavered slightly under Torin's unblinking gaze. Torin did not speak. He simply looked at the guard, then at his partner who remained on horseback, then back. After a long moment he gave a single slow nod. It was an acceptance not of their power, but of the necessity of the confrontation. He stepped back, a silent instruction for Elara to come forward. Fear coiled in her stomach, but seeing his calm resolve, she found a sliver of her own. She pulled her wool cloak around her shoulders and stepped out into the world with Torin at her side. The atmosphere at the Baron's keep was not one of judgment, but of suffocating despair. Servants scurried through the stone halls with downcast eyes, and a heavy silence pressed in on them, the kind that follows a tragedy. They were led to the great hall, where the Baron sat slumped in his high-backed chair, looking not like a lord, but like a broken father. Father Alcuin stood near him, his face a mask of pious concern, but his eyes glittered with triumph as he saw them enter. He believed this was his victory. "My lord," the priest began, his voice slick with false sympathy, "I warned you of the darkness this woman brings." The Baron raised a weary hand, silencing him. He looked at Elara, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a raw, desperate plea. "My son," he said, his voice hoarse, "the physicians can do nothing. A fever burns through him. He will not last the night." Elara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that fever. She knew its quick, deadly work. She looked past the Baron to a small adjoining room, where the boy lay pale and still on a large bed. This was the moment. The fear in her heart was still there, a cold, familiar stone, but beneath it was the steady, quiet confidence of the healer. She knew what to do. She took a step forward, drawing the eyes of every person in the room. "My lord," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I have seen this sickness before. I have treated it." Father Alcuin scoffed. "Witchcraft, my lord. She will kill him with her dark potions and damn his soul." "Your prayers have done nothing," the Baron roared, his grief erupting into a flash of fury that made the priest recoil. He turned his desperate gaze back to Elara. "You can save him?" "I can try," she said honestly. "But the cure requires herbs from the forest, willow bark, and feverfew from the shaded banks of the creek." This was the priest's chance to stop her. "The forest is not safe for her," he sneered. "The villagers are God-fearing folk. They would not suffer a witch to walk freely." It was a threat, plain and simple. Before the Baron could respond, Torin, who had been silent as a statue, took a half-step forward. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the hall. "I will take her," he said, looking directly at the Baron. "I will keep her safe." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. The Baron stared at the blacksmith, then at the healer, then at the useless, fuming priest. He was a man with nothing left to lose. "Go," he commanded. "Bring what you need. But hear this, woman. If my son lives, you will have my protection for the rest of your days. If he dies—" He did not need to finish the sentence. Torin became her shield. He walked beside her into the woods, his presence a silent warning to any who might have thought to follow. In the deep quiet of the forest, she gathered what she needed, her movements sure and practiced. When they returned, the keep was even quieter, the spectre of death having drawn closer. Elara was led to the boy's bedside. Torin did not follow. He stood guard outside the chamber door, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He was an immovable guardian, his silent form a direct challenge to Father Alcuin, who paced the hall like a caged wolf. Inside, Elara worked. She crushed the herbs, steeped the bark, her mind focused solely on the task. She ignored the wealth of the room, the fine tapestries, the down pillows. It was just her, the boy. and the ancient knowledge of the earth. She coaxed the boy to drink the bitter tea, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth. When she had done all she could, she emerged from the room, her face pale with exhaustion. She met Torin's questioning gaze and gave a small, uncertain nod. The Baron rushed to her side, his eyes wild with hope and fear. "Is it done?" he whispered. "I have given him the remedy," she answered quietly. "It will either break the fever or it will not. The next few hours will decide it." They stood there in the great hall, a strange assembly of hope and hate. The blacksmith, the healer, the father, and the priest. All of them watched the door to the sick room waiting. The life of a child, the fate of a priest's power, and the future of the two outcasts from the forge all hung suspended in the suffocating silence of that room. All they could do now was wait. The silence in the Baron's hall was a fragile thing, stretched thin by the weight of waiting. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant cough, sent a fresh wave of tension through the room. The Baron stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the door to his son's chamber. Father Alcuin prayed in a low, venomous whisper. His words meant not for God's ears, but for theirs. Torin remained by the main entrance, a silent sentinel, his presence the only solid thing in a world of uncertainty. An hour passed, feeling like a lifetime. Then another. Elara's composure, so steady while she worked, began to fray. She had done all she knew how to do. The rest was in the hands of the boy's own strength and the ancient power of the herbs. Just as the first hint of dawn began to grey the high windows of the hall, the door to the sick room opened. A serving woman stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide. The Baron took a sharp, pained breath, preparing for the worst. But the woman was smiling, her expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The fever, it has broken. He is sleeping peacefully." A ragged, choked sob escaped the Baron's lips. It was a sound of profound relief, of a pain so great its release was itself a wound. He stumbled into his son's room, and a moment later, his joyful cries confirmed the news. The boy was alive. Father Alcuin stared, his face ashen. The miracle he had prayed against had come to pass. His power, built on fear and divine judgment, had been undone by a handful of leaves and the quiet knowledge of a woman he had condemned. He saw in the Baron's joy the reflection of his own utter defeat. When the Baron returned to the hall, his face was transformed. The grief was gone, replaced by a clarity as hard and bright as forged steel. He walked directly to Elara. He did not speak. He simply took her hand and bowed his head over it, a gesture of profound respect that silenced the entire keep. Then he turned to Father Alcuin. "You came to me with talk of God's will," the Baron said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You spoke of punishment and sin, but your God is a cruel one, priest, and I see now that his cruelty is merely a reflection of your own." He pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "You used my people's fear as a weapon. You offered them damnation when this woman offered them a cure. You are a poison in this land. You will gather your things and be gone by midday. If you ever set foot in my lands again, I will have you hanged not as a man of God, but as the charlatan you are." The priest, stripped of all authority, all pride, simply stared in disbelief before scurrying away, a shadow fleeing the coming dawn. The Baron turned back to Elara and Torin, his expression softening. "You have my protection," he declared, his voice ringing with the full force of his authority. "Your home, your work, your lives, you are under my sworn word. No one will ever harm you again." The walk back to the forge was quiet. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the village. The world felt new, washed clean. The few villagers who were out early saw them walking from the keep and simply stared, their fear now mixed with a dawning awe. The spell of the priest was broken. They reached the forge, their sanctuary, now truly safe. The air inside was cool and familiar. Without a word, Torin, a man of unshakable routine, went to the hearth. He took his heavy smithing hammer not to work but to hold. It was a comfort to him, the familiar weight and balance of it in his hands. He began to clean his tools, his movements a way of processing the night's events. Elara watched him. In the soft morning light, she saw him not as a giant or a savior or a mystery. She saw the man who had stood between her and death, who had faced down a priest and a lord, who had done it all without a word of promise, but with the simple, unwavering certainty of his actions. She walked towards him, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. He looked up as she approached. She stopped in front of him and looked at the hammer in his hands. Gently, she placed her hands over his on the smooth wooden handle. He did not resist as she carefully lifted the heavy hammer from his grasp and set it quietly aside on the anvil. His fight was over. His work was done. Then, she took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. It was a hand scarred by fire and labor, a hand that could shatter stone but had untied her ropes with care. She lifted it to her cheek and pressed it against her skin, closing her eyes. It was a gesture that said everything she had no words for. It was gratitude. It was trust. It was a vow. He stood perfectly still for a moment, and then his other hand came up to cover hers, enveloping them in a warmth that had nothing to do with the forge fire. He looked down at her, and for the first time, the stony mask was gone from his face. In his eyes she saw the ghosts of his past finally at peace, and the quiet, certain promise of a future. The unspoken vow was sealed. The seasons turned, and the years settled into a quiet peace around the forge. The dark stone of the cottage, once stark and lonely, was softened now by the vibrant life that grew around it. The small patch of earth where Elara had planted her first defiant herbs had flourished, expanding into a lush garden that spilled over with the colors of chamomile, lavender, and rose. The air no longer smelled only of coal and iron, but also of mint and thyme, and the sweet scent of a blossoming apple tree. The forge itself was no longer a place of solitude, but the warm, beating heart of a family. The clang of the hammer was often accompanied by the sound of children's laughter. A small boy, not yet 10, with his father's broad shoulders and steady gaze, expertly stacked kindling beside the forge door. He worked with a serious focus, a miniature version of the giant who had once stood alone against the world. Nearby, a little girl with her mother's gentle hands and deep, thoughtful eyes sat on a small stool, carefully grinding dried herbs with a stone pestle. She worked with the quiet competence of a healer in training, her world a place of wonder and purpose. From the doorway of the cottage, Elara and Torin watched them. The years had etched fine lines of contentment around their eyes. His hand, no longer a symbol of a silent claim, but of a shared life, rested on her shoulder, and her hand came up to rest upon his. The sun began to dip below the distant wooded hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. Its warm, fading light mingled with the soft, constant glow from the forge hearth behind them. They did not speak. They had never needed many words. Their life was not built on promises spoken, but on kindnesses shown, on a bond forged in the heart of a fire. In the quiet space between the hammer and the hearth, they had built a lasting peace.